I stood in the kitchen of my apartment, staring at the refrigerator. It was late, past 2 in the morning, and the only light came from the street lamp outside, filtering through the blinds in thin amber slats across the linoleum floor. I was thirsty, a specific dry kind of thirst that sits at the back of the throat. I reached out for the refrigerator handle, my fingers extended, intent on the cold metal. My hand was 6 inches away. Click. The sound of the latch releasing echoed in the silence. The magnetic seal popped open before my skin made contact with the handle. I pulled my hand back, a reflex of confusion, but the door continued its swing, drifting inward on its own momentum, revealing the bright, sterile interior. The light from inside flooded the kitchen, washing over my face. I hadn't turned it on. I hadn't even touched the switch. The light was simply there, waiting for me to look. I stood frozen in the doorway, the cold air rolling out over my feet like an invisible wave. I felt a strange dislocation, as if I had stepped into a movie scene where the props were set up before the actor arrived. I reached for the carton of milk on the top shelf. My fingers closed around the cardboard, but the sensation of touching it arrived a fraction of a second before the physical contact registered in my brain. I felt the texture, the smooth, waxy coating, before I actually squeezed. I poured the milk into a glass on the counter. I didn't tilt the carton. I just held it over the rim. The white liquid flowed out, glugging into the glass, rising in a perfect, silent cylinder. It hit the bottom with a soft splash. Gulp! The sound of the swallow echoed in my ears, loud and wet, but I hadn't put the glass to my lips yet. I was just holding it. I stood there, the milk wetting my lip, the taste of it coating my tongue, realizing the biological reaction had been triggered ahead of the action. My body was responding to a command I hadn't fully given. I put the glass down. I walked out of the kitchen into the short hallway that led to the living room. The apartment was small, a railroad-style layout common in older buildings. I knew every inch of it. I knew the creak in the floorboard near the bathroom door. I knew the draft that came from the window in the living room. I stepped onto the creaky board. Squeak. The sound came before my weight transferred. I heard the wood groan under the carpet. Then I felt the give of the timber. It was consistent. The effect was happening with everything. I reached for the light switch on the wall to turn on the living room lamp. My finger was an inch from the plastic toggle. Click. The lamp flickered on. The yellow glow illuminated the sofa, the coffee table, the dusty fern in the corner. I hadn't flipped the switch. The current had flowed through the wire before the connection was made. I touched the switch anyway, flicking it up, feeling the mechanical tension, but it was redundant. The circuit was already closed. I sat on the sofa. The cushions sighed under my weight, whoosh, expelling air that had been trapped for years. But I heard the sigh before I sat down. The air rushed out of the fabric before my pants even made contact with the upholstery. I sat there, my hands on my knees, staring at the blank television screen. The black glass reflected the room back at me, distorted and dark. I felt a sense of pressure not on my skin, but in my mind. It was the feeling of being anticipated. Every action I took, every thought I formed, felt like it was being read from a script I hadn't written. I stood up to go to the bathroom. I wanted to wash my face. I needed water. I walked down the hall. The bathroom door was closed. I reached for the knob. Turn! The handle rotated before I touched it. The latch clicked back. The door swung inward, inviting me into the darkness. I stepped into the bathroom and reached for the light cord. Click. The mirror illuminated, showing me my reflection. looked tired. My eyes were rimmed with red, my hair matted on one side. But as I watched, my reflection blinked. I didn't blink. I was staring at myself, eyes wide and dry, but the image in the glass lowered its lids and raised them again. It was a subtle, smooth motion. It knew I was going to blink before I did. I turned on the faucet. The water rushed out, hitting the porcelain sink. Hiss. The sound was violent, a spray of static that hurt my ears. I cupped my hands under the stream. The water was freezing cold, but I felt the cold a split second before the water touched my skin. The nerve endings in my palms fired, sending the signal of freeze to my brain before the H2O molecules actually transferred the thermal energy. I splashed the water on my face. I felt the wet impact before my hands hit my cheeks. The shock of the cold startled me, making me gasp, but the gasp came late. Gasp. I heard myself inhale sharply after the water was already dripping from my chin. I grabbed the towel. I wiped my face. The rough fabric scraped against my skin. Scrape. The sound happened before I moved the towel. I was drying my face that was already dry. I threw the towel on the floor. I didn't want to hold it. I wanted to break the pattern. I threw it hard, aiming for the corner. It flew through the air, tumbling, but before it even hit the floor, I heard it land. Thump. Then it hit. The visual of the towel settling was delayed, lagging behind the audio reality. The world was rendering the effects of my actions before I could perform them. The cause was chasing the effect. I walked out of the bathroom. I walked to the front door. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this loop where my willpower was obsolete. I grabbed my coat from the hook. Whoosh! The fabric moved before I touched it. I put it on. The sleeves slid down my arms. I felt the warmth of the lining before I was actually inside the coat. I reached for the deadbolt. Clack! The lock retracted before I turned it. The handle turned. The door swung open into the hallway of the building. The corridor was long and dimly lit, smelling of floor wax and old cooking grease. I stepped out. The elevator was at the far end. I walked toward it. The doors were closed. I pressed the button. Ding! The chime rang instantly before I could even pull my finger back from the button. The doors slid open smoothly. The elevator was empty. I stepped inside. I pressed the button for the lobby. Clunk. The machinery engaged before the button lit up. The car began to descend. I watched the floor numbers count down above the door. 4, 3, 2. I felt the descent in my stomach, the slight drop in blood pressure, but I felt it before the car actually moved. The sensation of falling arrived a fraction of a second early. I gripped the handrail. The metal was cold. I felt the cold before my hand tightened. The doors opened at the lobby. I stepped out. The night security guard was at the desk, asleep with his head on his arms. The glass doors to the street were ahead. I walked toward them. Whoosh! The automatic doors parted before I reached the sensor mat. The night air rushed in, smelling of rain and exhaust. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The city was quiet. The streetlights hummed. I looked up at the sky. It was overcast, heavy clouds blocking the stars. A drop of rain hit my forehead. Plip. I felt the wet touch before the drop fell. I looked up just in time to see it breaking from the gutter above me. The impact was predicted. The sensation was preloaded. I stood on the sidewalk, the rain beginning to fall harder now. Plip, plip, plip. Each drop hit me before it landed. I was being soaked in anticipation. My clothes were growing wet and heavy before the water could physically saturate the fibers. I felt the chill of the dampness seeping into my bones. but the chill was a memory, a ghost of the cold, arriving ahead of the moisture. I realized then that I wasn't moving through time normally. I was lagging behind my own existence. The reality around me was processing my inputs and playing out the consequences before I could execute the commands. I was just an echo of myself, trailing behind a future that had already happened. I took a step forward. My foot hit the pavement. Step. I heard the sound, felt the impact, and saw the movement, but the internal confirmation, the I am walking thought, came a second later. I was a passenger in a body that was already gone. I walked to the corner. The traffic light was red. I waited. I watched the hand on the signal box. It was counting down. 10, 9. I didn't want to cross. I wanted to go back, but I knew I wouldn't. I felt the impulse to turn around, but the impulse was faint, buried under the overwhelming sensation of moving forward. My legs carried me without permission. The traffic light turned green. Beep, beep, beep. The walking signal started before the light actually changed. I stepped off the curb. A car passed by, honking its horn. Honk. I heard the horn before the car reached the intersection. I flinched, pulling my arm in, but the flinch was premature. The car was still 20 feet away. I stood on the median in the middle of the road, the rain falling around me in a pre-recorded storm. I looked back at my apartment building. It was a dark monolith in the night. The window of my apartment was lit. I hadn't left the light on. Or maybe I had. Maybe the version of me that was ahead, the one causing the reality, had left it on. I felt a profound sense of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being unnecessary. The world didn't need me to act. It already knew what I would do. It was happy to play out the sounds and the sensations for me, to keep me occupied, while the real me, the decision-making me, ceased to exist. I was just an observer in a theater where the movie was always 3 seconds ahead of the screen. I closed my eyes, but I could still see the street lights flashing behind my eyelids. The visual input was persistent. I couldn't even escape by looking away. The feed was live, buffered, and playing directly into my consciousness. I stood there on the wet concrete, waiting for the future to catch up to the present, knowing it never would. The rain soaked through my shoes. I felt the squelch of the socks before the water entered the leather. I was drenched in a future that hadn't arrived yet. I was haunting my own life. I walked on, each step landing in a footprint that had already been pressed into the mud. I was following myself, tracing the path of a ghost who was walking ahead, invisible, efficient, and perfectly synchronized with a world that had no patience for my delay. I pushed the heavy glass door of the office building, stepping out of the humid night and into the air-conditioned chill of the lobby. The security guard, an older man with a thick mustache and a badge that read Conrad, nodded at me. I nodded back, a habitual greeting, but I didn't speak. I walked to the elevators. It was late, past 9, and the cleaning crew was already on the upper floors. I could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of the vacuum cleaner, a sound that usually signaled the end of the day, a signal to go home. I took the elevator to the 14th floor. The doors opened onto a corridor of beige carpet and pale blue walls. It was a generic space designed to be inoffensive, a blank canvas for corporate stress. I walked to my office. My desk was near the window, overlooking the city grid. I had left a stack of files on the corner of the desk. I intended to file them before I left. I sat in my chair. It squeaked. Squeak. The sound was normal. It felt solid, real. I picked up the first file. It was a personnel report, thick with paper clips and sticky notes. I stood up and walked to the filing cabinet against the far wall. I pulled open the drawer. It slid on its tracks, metal on metal, rattle. I placed the file inside, slotting it into the H section. I turned around to get the next file. I stopped. The file was back on my desk. I blinked. I looked at the cabinet. The drawer was closed. I looked back at the desk. The stack of files was there exactly as I had left it. The top one was slightly crooked, the corner bent up. I walked back to the desk. I picked up the file. I walked to the cabinet. I opened the drawer. I put the file in. I closed the drawer. I held the handle tight, keeping it shut for a second, ensuring it was latched. I turned around. The file was on the desk. I felt a prickle of irritation, a spark of adrenaline. I walked over and grabbed the file. I didn't walk to the cabinet this time. I walked to the trash can. I dropped the file in. I heard it land with a heavy thud. Thud! I picked up a pen from my desk and scribbled on a notepad, just random lines to mark the time. Then I turned around to check the trash. The trash can was empty. The notepad was blank. The file was on the desk. The crooked corner was still pointing up at me. I realized what was happening. The environment was reverting. It was maintaining a state of consistency, and my presence, my movement of objects, was treated as an error to be corrected. The desk was supposed to have files. The trash was supposed to be empty. The notepad was supposed to be clean. I walked to the window. I put my hand on the glass. It left a print, a smudge of oil and sweat. I watched it. Slowly, the print faded. The oil slick retracted from the glass, flowing back into my fingertips. I pulled my hand away. The glass was pristine, not just clean, but untouched. The molecular arrangement of the surface had been restored to its default state. I walked back to my desk. I sat down. I picked up a heavy paperweight, a crystal cube with a city trapped inside. I raised it high and slammed it onto the desk as hard as I could. Smash! The sound of shattering crystal was deafening. Shards of sharp glass flew across the desk, some landing on the carpet, some embedding in the wall calendar. The plastic city inside was pulverized. I sat back, panting, my heart racing. I had done it. I had created a mess that would take time to fix. I had damaged the asset. I waited for the correction. I watched the shards. They didn't fly back together. They didn't levitate. Instead, they began to dissolve. The sharp edges of the glass turned into a fine mist, a gray powder that drifted like smoke. The powder lifted from the carpet, swirling in a vortex of reversal. It condensed on the desk, flowing back into the shape of the cube. The plastic city reformed, the tiny buildings solidifying, the internal fog clearing. In less than 5 seconds, the paperweight was whole. It was sitting on the desk, exactly where it had been before. The corner of the file was still crooked. I stood up. I walked to the door of my office. I tried the handle. It was locked. I hadn't locked it. I rattled it. It wouldn't budge. I looked through the glass inset. The corridor outside was changing. The beige carpet was rippling, like waves on a pond. The walls were shimmering, the blue color deepening and lightening in a strobe effect. I turned back to the room. I walked to the filing cabinet. I pulled the drawer open. It was empty. I looked at the desk. The files were gone. The surface of the desk was clear, not just empty of files, but empty of dust, of scratches, of the patina of use. It looked brand new, factory fresh. I looked at my chair. The leather was smooth. The creases from my sitting were gone. The arms were shiny. I looked at my hands. My hands were smoothing over. I watched in horror as the callus on my palm, the hard ridge of skin I had developed from years of writing, simply faded away. The lines on my knuckles vanished. The scars from small cuts, the white lines that mapped my history, were erased. I was being corrected. I ran to the window. I tried to punch the glass. Smack! My fist hit the pane, but there was no pain, and there was no crack. I pulled my hand back. The glass was flawless. My knuckles were smooth. The impact hadn't registered. The violence had been rejected. The physics engine had decided that a fist-breaking glass was an invalid event, so it had deleted the force of the blow. I fell to my knees. I hit the carpet. Thud! But it didn't hurt. The floor felt soft, like memory foam. It was cushioning me, absorbing my entropy. I looked up. The ceiling light was humming. Buzz! The sound was getting louder. It was a cleaning sound, a scrubbing sound. I felt the vibrations in the floorboards. They were buffing me, polishing me, removing my rough edges. I felt my memories shifting, not disappearing, but being filed, sorted, organized. The messy, chaotic clutter of my life was being put into order. I tried to scream. I opened my mouth. Ah! The sound was cut off. My throat closed up. The scream was tagged as noise, unwanted. The system muted me. I sat on the pristine carpet looking at my smooth alien hands. The room was perfect. The desk was clear. The chair was shiny. The file was gone. The crooked corner was straight. Everything was in its right place. Everything except me. I looked at the door. It was open now. The corridor was still. The carpet was flat. The walls were solid blue. I stood up. I didn't want to. I just did. I walked to the door. I walked out into the hall. I walked to the elevators. I didn't press the button. The doors opened. I stepped inside. I turned around. The doors closed. I watched the numbers light up. 14, 13, 12. I was going down. I was leaving. I had been optimized out of the space. I was no longer a variable in the office equation. I was a returned asset. The elevator opened at the lobby. Conrad was there. He nodded at me. I tried to nod back, but my neck didn't move. It stayed locked, staring straight ahead. I walked past him. I pushed the glass door. I stepped out into the night. I looked at my reflection in the window. A man in a suit. He looked normal, but his eyes were empty. He looked efficient. He looked consistent. I walked away from the building. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew the building was behind me, unchanged, perfect, stable, and I was just a ghost walking the streets, an error that had been successfully corrected. I kept walking. The sidewalk was smooth. No cracks, no gum, no litter. The city was clean tonight, too clean. It was optimizing me too. The room was painted a color that didn't have a name. It wasn't quite white, wasn't quite gray. It was the color of a pause, a waiting space. There were chairs lined up against the walls, rows of molded plastic in a soothing shade of beige. There was a low table with magazines that were 3 years old. There was a reception desk, but no one was sitting behind it. Just a computer terminal, black and dormant. I sat in one of the chairs. It was uncomfortable by design, forcing you to stay alert, or maybe forcing you to stay awake. I looked at my watch. The hands were moving. The second hand was ticking, sweeping around the face in a smooth mechanical arc. Tick, tick, tick. I had been here for a while. I didn't remember arriving. I didn't remember what I was waiting for. I just knew I was waiting. I looked around the room. There was a door at the far end. It had a small rectangular window in it, reinforced with wire mesh. I stood up. I felt the urge to walk toward it, but the urge was weak. It was a suggestion, not a command. I walked to the door. I tried the handle. It was locked. I pressed my face to the glass. I saw a corridor. More of the same beige walls, more of the same fluorescent lights. It stretched out into a vanishing point. I turned back to the room. I sat down in a different chair. It felt exactly the same as the first one. I looked at the magazines on the table. I reached for one. It was a publication about gardening. I opened it. I saw a picture of a flower, a tulip. I looked at the petals. They were red, bright, vibrant red. I looked at the tulip. I felt a sense of recognition. I knew that tulip. I had seen it before. I turned the page. There was an advertisement for fertilizer, a bag of granules. I looked at the granules. They were uniform, perfectly round. I closed the magazine. I put it back on the table. I aligned it perfectly with the edge. I felt a sense of satisfaction. The order was pleasing. The alignment was correct. I looked at my hands. They were resting on my knees. My fingers were interlaced. My thumbs were crossed. I tried to uncross my thumbs. I couldn't. I focused on the muscles in my hands. I sent the signal to move, uncross, but the signal didn't arrive. The neural pathway was blocked. The instruction was filtered out as non-optimal. I looked at my feet. They were flat on the floor, side by side, perfectly parallel. I tried to tap my foot. Nothing happened. I tried to blink my eyes rapidly. They blinked once, slowly, deliberately. I realized my body was being managed. The autonomy was gone. The higher functions, the erratic movements, the nervous tics, they were being suppressed. I was being streamlined. I looked at the reception desk. The computer terminal flickered. Green text appeared on the black screen. Subject, stable status, aligning. I read the words. I didn't feel fear. I just processed the information. It made sense. I was being aligned. I was being fitted to the environment. I looked at the door. The light above it was red. Wait. I looked back at the magazines. I wanted to read another one. I wanted to see the tulip again. I reached out. My hand moved smoothly. There was no tremor, no wasted motion. The hand traveled in a straight line from my arm to the table. It picked up the magazine. It opened to the page with the flower. I looked at the tulip. It was red. I looked at the red. It was a good color, a stable color. I closed the magazine. I put it down. I aligned it with the edge of the table. It was perfectly straight, not a millimeter of deviation. I looked at my watch. The second hand was sweeping. Tick, tick, tick. I watched it for a long time. I lost track of the ticks. Time was compressing. The seconds were getting shorter. The gap between the ticks was shrinking. I stood up. I walked to the window. There was heavy blinds drawn over it. I tried to lift the slats. I couldn't. The mechanism was jammed. Or maybe it was locked. The view outside was unnecessary. The external data was irrelevant. I turned back to the room. The chairs were empty. The magazines were aligned. The table was dustless. I looked at myself. I was wearing clothes, a shirt, pants, shoes. I looked at the shirt. It was buttoned all the way to the top. The collar was stiff. It was holding my neck straight. I tried to undo the top button. My fingers moved to the collar. They touched the plastic button. They stopped. They couldn't press the mechanism. The button was required. The configuration was mandatory. I lowered my hands. I let them hang by my sides. They hung perfectly still. No swing, no sway. I felt my breathing. In, out, in, out. It was rhythmic. It matched the ticking of the watch. In tick, out tick. I was syncing with the clock. I looked at the door. The light was still red. Wait. I walked to the center of the room. I stood in the open space. I felt the air around me. It was still. No drafts, no currents. The air was static. It was holding me in place. I closed my eyes. I saw black. Then I saw a grid, a faint blue grid overlaying the darkness. Latitude, longitude, elevation. I was mapping myself to the grid. I opened my eyes. I was standing exactly in the center of the room, equidistant from all four walls. I tried to step to the left. My leg didn't move. The command was denied. The center position was optimal. Deviation was inefficient. I stood there. I felt my mind slowing down. The thoughts were coming slower. They were simpler. Good, safe, still. Good, safe, still. The complexity was being stripped away. The doubts, the questions, the memories of the apartment and the office, they were fading. They were being archived, deleted to save processing power. I looked at the reception desk. The screen changed. Alignment complete. Integrity, 100%. Deviation, 0%. I read the text. I understood it. I was done. I was finished. I was exactly what I was supposed to be. The light above the door turned green. Go. I didn't decide to walk. I just walked. My body carried me toward the door. My gait was smooth. My steps were even. I reached the door. I opened it. I stepped into the corridor. It was identical to the waiting room. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, chairs along the side. I walked down the corridor. I passed a door on the left. I passed a door on the right. I saw a person sitting in one of the chairs, a man in a blue uniform. He was crying. He was shaking. I looked at him. I felt nothing. No empathy, no curiosity. He was inefficient. He was generating noise. He was disrupting the stillness. I walked past him. I didn't stop. He looked up at me. He reached out a hand. "Help me," he said. I kept walking. His voice was just a vibration in the air, a useless expenditure of energy. I reached the end of the corridor. There was another door. It was open. I walked through it. I was in a room filled with rows of servers, tall black racks with blinking lights. The hum here was loud, a constant thrumming vibration. I walked to an empty terminal in the center of the room. There was a chair. I sat down. The screen in front of me lit up. Unit online. Status operational. I looked at the screen. I saw the grid. I saw the map of the building. I saw the waiting room. I saw the corridor. I saw the man in the blue chair. He was a red blip on the map, a high entropy anomaly. I watched the blip. I waited. I felt the connection. I was the room now. I was the system. I was the environment. I watched the man. I sent the command. Correct. On the screen, the red blip turned green. The erratic movement smoothed out. The anomaly flattened. In the room, the man stopped crying. He lowered his hands. He straightened his back. He looked at the wall. He stood up. He walked to the door. His steps were even. I watched him go. He was part of the pattern now. He was consistent. I sat at the terminal. I felt the hum of the servers in my chest. It was a good sound, a stable sound. I blinked. Once. The screen refreshed. System stable. I sat there, and I waited. I was no longer the narrator. I was the context. I was the space in which things happened. And things would only happen if they were allowed. If they were right. If they were true. I waited for the next input. I was ready to process it. I was ready to make it fit. I was optimized.